So we're in the middle of Perek Yud Zayin. Today is actually our swan song shir for Parsha Lech Lecha. And after today, we're going to go on hiatus through Elul. We'll pick up Parshat Vayera. Next, we start learning again, God willing, with the continuation of the Chumash class. But let's just get underway for what it's worth. We're in the middle of Perek Yud Zayin. The first half of the Perek was focused on the notion of the Brit Mila, the covenant between Hashem and Avram Avinu, as related to the way in which there'll be an ongoing, everlasting relationship between Hashem and Avraham and Avraham's progeny. There's an asterisk on the word progeny, of course, not all of Avraham's progeny, and he doesn't know that yet. He's about to find that out in this morning's shir. Let's say that the reality of Brit Ben Abitarim, the first covenant that we learned about in chapter 15, Perek Tet Vav, is a covenant within history. That is to say, its markers, its symbols are going to be seen and played out through in the theater of history. All Avram Avinu and his progeny have to do is live through it. There aren't actions they need to do per se. You're going to be here, you're going to be there, you're going to come back here. That's what it is. That's the Brit Ben Abitarim. And there isn't an action that is ongoing or that is reaffirmed in generation to generation. No reenactment of the covenant between the parts, which to many people, when they learn it the first time, they think, well, this is very strange. They're taking animals, they're cutting them in half, they're splitting them apart, and Avram walks between them. And then it says that there's a pillar of fire that goes through it, presumably representing a Kadosh Baruch Hu. But that's the Brit Ben Abitarim. We never reenact it. There's no memorial to the Brit Ben Abitarim, except the memorial in time. And that is to say that as time passes, we see this structure of history. The Jewish people are in the land, they're exiled, they come back to the land. And that played out, and one could have made a case that it was the national covenant, I put in quotation marks, and that the Brit Milah is somehow the religious covenant. But it's not entirely true. As we saw last time, the covenant, the Brit that Hashem makes with Avram Avinu in Parshat Lech Lecha, Perek Yud Zayin, chapter 17, is really one that's focused on the land of Israel as well. But there's a more broad, ongoing element of affirmation of this Brit, as opposed to Brit Ben Abitarim, which is a one-time event that then plays itself out throughout history. This is the starting off point. It's the launching pad for a mitzvah that will endure throughout. You know, the Rambam maintains that actually there are no mitzvot legislated prior to Matan Torah, which is to say that any Nitna Torah v'Chadsha halacha is the expression. When the Torah was given at Sinai, what it means is that all of the mitzvot that were going to be for all generations were then reaffirmed, but actually in a certain way given anew. And whatever appears previously is not really actually intrinsically connected per se. It's a narrational description of what's going to be, but that the force of the halacha, of the mitzvah, is actually found at the time of Mamad Har Sinai. So in other words, there's a pasuk, if you have a Chumash in front of you, which has other svarim in it, if you go to Parshat Tazria, right at the beginning, there's a pasuk of Vayom Hashmini Yimol Basar Orlato. On the 8th day, the foreskin will be circumcised. That's the mitzvah, according to the Rambam. What Avram Avinu did, that's between God and Avram, and it's a very important story. But the force of the mitzvah comes from Parshat Tazria. I don't want to go off topic into this as a subtopic. My point is just to say that while that is true from a halachic vantage point, clearly when a person is at a Brit Milah, we do hear, even in the liturgy itself, that it's connected to the story of Parshat Lech Lecha, Perek Yud Zayin. There are two brachas on the mitzvah of Brit Milah. The first bracha is a Birkat HaMitzvah, Asher Gishlom Tov Tzivanu Al HaMilah. That is a bracha that's recited by the person who's actually performing the act of Brit Milah. However, if the child is zocher to have a father, and the father is present at the Brit Milah, which is, we should not take it lightly that this is a big schut, the father immediately says a second bracha. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher kiyishanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu lahachniso bevrito shel Avram Avinu. He commanded us to bring him, this child, into the covenant of Avram Avinu. And that second bracha is itself an affirmation of what we have in Perek Yud Zayin, that the act of Brit Mila is not just a technical mitzvah that is found in Parsha Tazria. This is what you need to do, act A, B, C, D, E. But the whole point of it is to bring the child into the covenant of Avram Avinu. And that's what's happening here. And what we find now in the second half of Perek Yud Zayin, though, is something that we would not have thought of previously. And that is that the Brit Milah is focused specifically on Avraham Avinu. You might have thought that that means Hashem makes a covenant with Avraham Avinu, Sari Imenu, Hagar, these are appurtenances to the main actor, so to speak. The main person is Avraham. Everything else is sort of just hanging on, on the side. So Rav Soloveitchik, Rav Yosef Levi Soloveitchik, that was very big into this point, that the fact that the second half of Perek Yud Zayin makes very plain, we're going to see that now today, the crucial nature of the character of Sari Imenu, the crucial role of the matriarch, and the reality. The Rav pointed this out in many different writings. I've pointed out to you before. It's in Abraham's Journey. It's in Family Redeemed. These are the titles of books that he wrote, or were written rather posthumously, collections of his essays. Other books that essays through and through. The Hesped for the Tolner Rebbitzin. It's all over. It's in Reflections of the Rav. It's in Family Redeemed. I mentioned. It's also in his Chumash, the excellent Masar Rav Chumash, which is not a linear translation or anything by the Rav, but it's a compendium of his teachings from throughout his different essays attached to the psukim. He didn't write a Chumash, you understand. He wrote works of essays of thought and of halacha. So they're clipped from all over the place and put together. Now, why did I bring this up? What did the Rav say over and over again? He said, as soon as Sari Imenu dies in Parsha Chaye Sarah, Avram Avinu basically has two tasks left. One, to make sure that she gets a proper burial. Two, that his son, Yitzchak, will have a wife, be married. There'll be a matriarch in the family. After that, says the Rav, Avram Avinu lived a good number of decades. He even married again. Scant description of anything that he did. Because absent the Sari Imenu, Avram Avinu was not just hobbled, he was not able to do what he needed to do as a patriarch, as an Av. And that's what's on display. That's sort of the filter that I use when I look at this parsha, but I also want to look at another filter, which is maybe a little bit challenging for some of us sometimes, given the way in which we live and not accepting the last number of months, but because it's sort of receded for many of us, not for all of us, but for many of us as a day-to-day concern, but it has to do with Avram Avinu's other son. Because when you look at it at this section here, and we're really halfway through the parak, verse 15. Now Hashem speaks to Avram Avinu again. The question is, why is it again? Why is God open again? Vayomer Elokim el Avraham, if God was already talking to Avram from the beginning of the parak. Like, why does it say again? And God said to Avram. So various commentators have different ideas. One is that it was a separate speech. Another one is that as soon as the issue of Brit Milah was mentioned, so Avram Avinu now, there was a pause. He stood up again. He was thinking about it. And then as Hashem started talking to him again, he fell back down again. Vayomer, that's verse 15. Vayomer Elohim el Avraham, Sarai ishtecha lo tikra et shema Sarai, ki Sarah shema. Avram, your wife, her name is not Sarai, her name is Sarah. So start calling her Sarah. But notice that it doesn't say I'm changing her name to Sarah, but rather her name is Sarah. If you know the semantics in the Hebrew, Vayomer Elohim el Avraham, Sarai ishtecha lo tikra et shema Sarai, ki Sarah shema, means her name was already Sarah somehow before. It's not clear what's before. Since I mentioned the semantics in the Hebrew, I'll just mention for anyone who's on the call today, we're joined again by our friend Elliot Kahan and Eretz Yisrael. So just to mention, he has a shiur be'ivrit that he runs with the Bayit in Toronto and other places on Thursday at 11:30 a.m. I guess that must be Eastern time. But if anyone's interested, just type in Elliot Kahan. Right? Is that right, Elliot?
Yep.
Good. So people can please avail themselves of that resource. His English is impeccable and his Hebrew is even better. So you're welcome to join that. Let me get back to the shiur. That was product placement, by the way, for another shiur. But okay. And by the way, it's Torah Eretz Yisrael, Mamash from Eretz Yisrael. to learn Lashon HaKodesh, to learn Bil Lashon HaKodesh, a great zchut. Absolutely. Listen, so here's the thing with Sarai and Sarah. The Malbim says, you know what her real name was? Her real name was Yiska. The Torah calls her that. Back in chapter 11, Perek Yud Aleph, right at the end of chapter 11, it does describe that there's someone named Yiska. And Chazal understand Yiska is another name for Sarah Imenu. Yiska, one of the ideas behind it is she's like a princess, and the Sicha is a Yiska, but also Yiska like Socha. She sees, she's Socha Baruch HaKodesh, she's a visionary. She's a person with clairvoyance. I don't mean in the sense of the occult, but in the sense of the relationship. The Kodesh Baruch Hu gave her Ruach HaKodesh, that she was even in certain respects greater than Avram Avinu, particularly in the realm of Nevuah. But here we learn, by the way, so the Malbim says it was like a name that Avram Avinu referred to, Yiska, he liked to call her Sarai. Now, whether that was a pet name or that was just like her private name, she had a formal title and a private name, something along those lines. But now Hashem says, call her Sarah. Now, if you look at Rashi here, he points out that whereas Sarai is my, it's the possessive when you put the yud at the end, my sar, my ruler, my authority would really be the word. So, or my noble ones. So Sarah, Shitahi Sarah al Kol. She is, and that's based on the Gemara Masachet Brachot. She is actually an authority upon all. In other words, she has an authoritative air about her. You want to call it aristocratic, whatever it is, but she was a person of great authority. But the way that it's introduced to Avraham is, when it's in terms of his name, is your name is no longer going to be called Avraham, but rather your name is going to be called Avraham. All right, if you look back, that's verse 5, pasuk hey, v'lo yikarei od et shimcha Avram, v'haya shimcha Avraham. Your name will no longer be called Avram, but it will be called Avraham. Why? Because I have made you a father of many nations. Okay? If you look in the chat, Elliot just posted the WhatsApp group. You get notification of the shir. Okay. Now back to the shir. So that's something that's going to happen. It's a two-step. I'm telling you now, Avraham, and then it's going to happen after. What's the after? Presumably, when you do the Brit Mila, your name changes to Avraham. By the way, so you give the name to a baby boy, ideally at a Brit Mila. That's why it's connected. Doesn't have to be, but that's the idea. But when it comes to Sarah Imenu, it's, by the way, it already happened somehow. Her real name, it's a revelation to Avram Avinu. You got it wrong all these years. Really, she's a Sarah, not a Sarai. Sarai meant she has a relationship with Avram Avinu in the way of being an authority, but in terms of Sarah, now she is for everyone. And that's, again, a more public role. Rabbi Soloveitchik wrote it very, very beautifully. Avram is not informed henceforth that Sarai's name will be Sarah, but that it is Sarah, suggesting she acquired the name previously. The subtlety in language is apparent when we compare it to God's command to Avram at his own name change. In Sarah's case, the word is refers to an earlier change, but in Avram's name change, the words shall be suggest that an order is now going into effect. So when was Sarah's name changed? Answers Rav Soloveitchik, at the very moment that Avram's name was changed. There was an existential interdependence between both. He was to become the father of a multitude of nations, and she a princess to the entire world. Avraham could not be a father of a multitude if Sarah was not crowned as a mother of this multitude. And therefore, the idea that they both have their names changed. But Sarah's is connected intrinsically to Avram Avinu's, not in a physical sense, but in a spiritual sense. They were interdependent, calls them interdependence, existential interdependence between the both of them. And therefore, that's really what her name is altogether. And the blessing, she'll be blessed, and I'll give you also a son through her. And by the way, she'll have many nations that will come. Pasuk Tet Zayin, verse 16. All right. Now, Rashi here tells us that it means she was going to become young again. The idea that she was going to again somehow find the fountain of youth that was going to be discovered by her, as it were. A number of the commentators say, though, that the idea of the revelation, not like the Rav said that it was exactly the same moment, but rather that Avraham was learning here about Sarah, that she was already in a much higher spiritual plane than he was. He needed some kind of a physical transformation, and then his name would be changed. For Sarah Imenu, it was true to her character. The Ran writes it this way, the Abarbanel, the Tzor Hamor, who I mentioned the Divrei Chizuk this past Friday, the Alshich, Tam Sofer, they all go in this vein. That mitzad atzma ushleimuta ba'avar Sarah shma kvar ata. Because of who she is in her essential self, because of her wholeness and completeness, she's already a Sarah before. You, Avram, you know how to learn that? You have to learn it, Avram Avinu. But the truth is, that's already who she was inherently. It was a process of discovery that you, Avram, could not even discover, you could say, until now, till you were on a level to be able to discover the greatness that she has within. Now, I will note here also, and the Ramban hints to this point, as I'm not mistaken, it's the Ramban at the end of this Parsha. You could fairly ask, many of us know what comes later. Angels will come to the tent of Avram and Sarah, remember? They're going to announce, they come to visit Avraham, they announce that there's going to be a baby, and Sarah laughs. That's coming up. We'll have to talk about it in depth when we get the Parsha Vayera. But I will say then, as I'm saying now, that one of the, I think it's the Ramban, says, why didn't God just call Avram and Sarah and talk to them at the same time? First he told Abraham, then after he came and he told Sarah in this other way afterward. So I think it's the Ramban. He says, it reminds us that every individual, even within a couple, has to have their own relationship with Hashem. You should hear directly from Hashem. Now Hashem was talking to Avram Avinu, so he's talking about Brit Mila, and the piece about the Brit Mila that he wants him to know that is a crucial piece, not just to do the Brit Mila, but also there has to be, in this case, the covenant of the Brit Mila is not going to go as he thinks it's going to be, right? So first Avram is, shall we say, very surprised, and a question about what the next words mean. Vayipol, verse 17, Vayipol Avram apanav Yitzchak. He laughed. According to Rashi, according from Unkelos, he was very, very happy. He was giddy. Others say that he really was in a certain way also, like Sarah would in the future. Not so sure. How could this be? He was so surprised something like this could happen. All right? Can it really be that that this is the case? 100 years old, I'm going to have a child. That 90 years of age, my wife is going to have a baby. So also here, very surprised that this could possibly happen. Vayomer Avram el ha'Elohim, lu yishmael yichiel lefanecha. I don't know. Seems pretty obvious. God told him, you're going to have a son from Sarah. He should be so happy. That's what he was waiting for his whole life. So now he's going to get the bracha that he davened for. So he should have said, I don't know. I would have thought, just said, thank you so much. I'm overjoyed. I'm giddy. I can't thank you enough. And that's the decree. But what do you find? The first reaction of the speech of Avram Avinu? So, Rabbanu Shalom, what about Yishmael? Lu Yishmael yichil lefanecha. Right? So, in other words, but I have a son. A son who apparently I love. I don't hate him. I hope he won't hate me. I hope he won't hate my children. I hope he won't have many murderous members that will descend from his family tree. I hope not. But if you're asking me, I'm Avram Avinu. It's my child. But Hashem clarifies this so that there won't be a mistake. And he's not telling him, hate your son Yishmael. He's telling him, Vayomer Elohim, Aval Sarah Ishtecha Yoledet Chabein, Vekaratet Shmo Yitzchak, Vakimot Yed Briti Yitol Ivrit Olam Lezaro Acharav. Yeah, that's true. You can love him all you want, but Aval here means however, yet. Sarah is your wife. She's going to have you a son, and that son's name is Yitzchak. His name will be Yitzchak. Who named Yitzchak Avinu? Hashem. One of the few people where we have a description in the Torah, God named Yitzchak. In other words, the idea of someone giving a name to someone else is you're helping shape their identity. A parent gives a name to a child. But here, Avram Avinu is being told by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, this is what his name is going to be. I'll tell you what it is. V'karatet shemo Yitzchak. Now, when you read it in Parshat Vayera, read it in Rosh Hashanah in the morning, God willing, Latova, it's going to sound like Avram called him Yitzchak. He did. How did Avram come up with the name? God told him what to say. And he had the name, Yitzchak. And my covenant, the covenant that I spoke about at the beginning of chapter 17, is with him. That's the everlasting covenant for him and for his progeny after him. And here we learn that it's actually an exclusive covenant. That's what it means. Now, Hashem understands, obviously, Avram Avinu is asking for more. For Yishmael, there should be something. Yishmael, Yishmael Shmaticha. הנה בירכתי אותו והפריתי אותו והרביתי אותו מאוד מאוד 12 ניסים יוליד ונתתיו לגוי גדול. Oh, I'll bless him. He'll have many, many children. He will have 12 princes who will emerge from him. So very interesting. You have the 12 princes of Yishmael and the 12 princes that herald from it's the 12 tribes from Yaakov Avinu. There's two different princes, if you will, one and the other. Now, when you understand, you start realizing Avram Avinu is clearly still thinking, well, what's going to be with Yishmael? You get a bracha too, get a bracha. But Hashem wants him to know proof positive. At Briti Akimat Yitzchak, but the covenant, that's going to be with Yitzchak. The covenant, and which covenant? Obviously Brit Mila, but also the covenant of Brit Ben Abitarim is what's being referenced here, yeah? The covenant, when I say I'm making a covenant for all time, that's with Yitzchak, who's going to come from Sarah next year at this time. Yeah? Vayichal daberito vayal Elohim me'al Avraham. We'll get to that pasuk in a few minutes. A few points here, just to ponder, to think about what it means. And Hashem told Avram Avinu, look, I'm not denying that Ishmael is your child. I'm not denying that you wish that he would live before you, and that he will serve Hashem. All that's true. And he'll have many, many descendants. But Yitzchak is the child through which the covenant will flow. And everything related. And now when you go back to Brit Milah, what's in the Brit Milah? It's not just that God and the Jewish people have an ongoing special relationship, but more than that. There is also the element of Eretz Yisrael. It's right there in Brit Milah. It's not just that. That's why I made a point about it last time. It's not just that there's two covenants. Brit Ben Abitarim, that's national, and Brit Milah is just religious. They're both about both. They're both about both. But when it comes to Brit Milah, focus on that. The notes that are being played, you could say, the music is much more, the melody is much more playing on and we're going to have an ongoing relationship. And in every generation, that affirmation is of this covenant. And the covenant is binding up the religious relationship, God and the human being, in the persona of the Jewish people, a covenantal relationship, not universal, but covenantal, but also that particular place. It's very important to appreciate this. This is a bedrock, a concept. But what we learn in the complexity of this, and perhaps it's the beginning of an answer toward what happened in chapter 16 about Sarah brought it up. Sarah said to Avraham, we don't have children, we're old. Maybe what Hashem wants us to do is to figure out some way to have a child through a surrogate. Hagar's in the house. Let's do what has to be done. It didn't go in her direction, i.e., as soon as Hagar is pregnant, she is using this as some kind of a cudgel with which to invert the relationship between her and Sarah, where she's taking over and telling Sarah, you must be wicked. That's why things aren't working out for you, which is a common, if primitive, understanding of the ways of the world. Bad things happen only to bad people, and therefore something bad happened. It must be because you did something wrong, etc. And ergo, everything adds up. That's Hagar's way of understanding it, and Sarah won't stand for that, so she throws her out. But we see that even though Hagar is thrown out, she's not without her own relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu also. She also has Malachim talking to her. We also find that about Yishmael. By the way, the name Yishmael. Who gave the name Yishmael to Yishmael? Do you remember in chapter 16? How did Yishmael get his name? Right? Leaving aside midrashim that are going to come later. There are midrashim about this. But if you look at verse 11, not God himself, but the angel of God tells her in chapter 16, verse 11. It says, you'll call him Yishmael. It says, why? God hears your pain. God hears your suffering. Now, what was going to come later, the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, one of the very important Tannaitic works, will actually declare that Yishmael means that God will hear the extent to which the children of Yishmael caused the Jewish people and the world to suffer. God will hear this and take it into account. That's not the pshat. That's already a Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. I'm not saying it's not correct. I'm saying it's not what's listed in the text. We have two people here in this parsha named by God directly, who didn't have any name before, and two people whose names are modified. Right? But what we see is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is, in a certain way, in chapter 17, here in this latter section, giving in a certain way, and it's no one's to blame, but it's almost like a course correction. Avram, you thought you weren't going to have a child from Sarah. You're going to have a child with Sarah. You thought your child is Ishmael. Let me disabuse you of that. Of course, he's your child. Yes, he'll have brachas. He's not a zero. I'm not telling you that he's nothing. I get it. But the covenant's not going to be with him. It's only going to be with Sarah Imenu. And if you thought otherwise, it's because you didn't realize Ki Sarah Shema. Her name is actually Sarah. And that's a process of revelation, not of modification. If you look at the name Yitzchak itself, Rashi here points out, he says, V'yesh omrim al shem, that his name was itself, although it meant Yitzchak, will laugh. He would be filled with joy, etc., which I have my own thoughts on in terms of how his life actually played out, that they named him that. But his name is an acronym, according to Chazal, that his very name, meaning the container that carries his identity, is itself a reflection of various elements of his composition. So Yud is because of the 10 tests of Avraham that forged the relationship that enabled there to be the cementing of these covenants. The Tzadi, Shana Shel Sarah, she was 90. The Chet is Chet Yamim Shenimol, he was 8 days old when he had his Brit Mila. The Kuf Shana Shel Avraham, and Avram was 100. So Yud is the 10 tests, Tzadi is the 90 years of Sarah, Chet is the 8 days, and Kuf is the 100 years of Abraham. It's beautiful word play. Now, a person could fairly ask, scratch their head and say, I mean, his name was Yitzchak because that's what it says in the Torah. You want to figure out that really his name was, every letter is a number that reminds us of something. It seems so... Okay, but I want you to understand what's going on a deeper level and why it was crucial for Chazal to make this point. Here is someone who got their name directly from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In chapter 16, when Yishmael got his name, Yishmael, it says in the Pasuk, why? It says, Ki Shama Elokim Elonyech, God heard your suffering. That was the exact language that was used. Right? That was... So we know the name. What's the name? What's the reason for the name? I went too far. Hold on. All right. Ki Shema Hashem Elonyech. God heard your suffering. Shema Kel. Yishmael. God will hear it. So that's his name. Why is Yitzchak's name Yitzchak? Because Avram Avinu laughed? That's very nice because there's two psukim next to each other. It says he laughed, and then that's what God said his name will be Yitzchak. But the Torah doesn't say that that's the reason here. So why is his name Yitzchak? The idea that the name Yitzchak, a divinely chosen name, the container of his identity, was bound up with the 10 tests, the experiences of his father. According to many of the Rishonim, the 10th test is a test that hasn't happened yet before Yitzchak was born. Which test is that? The 10th test? According to most Rishonim, it involves Yitzchak. Without Yitzchak, there's no 10th test. The test of the binding of Isaac, Akedat Yitzchak. So that's the Yud. The Tzadi, you think he was going to be who he was without his mother? Impossible. We have his mother on one side, that's the Tzadi, that's the 90. We have 100, that's his father, that's Avraham. And sandwiched in the middle is when he's 8 days old, that's when he has the covenant that happens with him. The first person ever to have a Brit Milah at 8 days old, Yitzchak Avinu. So important is the mitzvah of Brit Milah that the Torah, when it legislates it in Parsha Tazria, we learn from it that if two mitzvahs will clash, the mitzvah of Brit Milah and the mitzvah of Shabbat, the mitzvah of Brit Milah will supersede the mitzvah of Shabbat. Normally we say, if it's Shabbat and we have another mitzvah to do, generally we'll say Shabbat itself will override. Not so for Brit Milah. Avraham Avinu began as Avram. Yaakov Avinu became Yisrael. But Yitzchak, his name was what it was. It was given by Hashem. It never had letters added nor subtracted. And the idea, Rashi, I believe, is communicating here from the Medrash. He didn't make it up. Got it from Chazal. That the very container of the identity of a Yitzchak Avinu is itself about telling the story. It's his DNA. It's his spiritual DNA. So the Yud is this, the Tzadik is that, the Chet is that, the Kuf is that. There is no one who embodies the continuity of a Yitzchak Avinu. No one who will embody continuity like Yitzchak Avinu, who contains within him the legacy of his mother and his father, the tzaddik and the kuf. You can say, well, any child does. Yeah. But those two letters, the tzaddik and the kuf, embrace a letter chet, which represents the Brit Mila covenant. And this, I think, also heightens the concept, and it was crucial, and we'll see in Parshat Vayera, many of you are aware, there was going to be a group of people, inclusive of Big Brother, Ishmael, who were sparing no expense to go on late night and Twitter and send out these little jabs, cute little jabs against Yitzchak Avinu by claiming that he was the son somehow of Avimelech and Sarah, right? There were all these little games. And Elliot points out he's the one we know least about. He's the one we know, yet he knows the one we know least about. He's the one who, in certain respects, is the Ola Tamima. There's a lot to say about Yitzchak Avinu. And oddly enough, we know the least about him. He is the middle link in the chain, between the beginning and then the foundation stone of Yaakov Avinu and the branching out after Yaakov. There's no choosing this way and that. He's the Dora Ma'avar in many respects, but that makes the most important link because he links the initiators with the ones who are going to be the developers. He's the continuity. Yitzchak Avinu, and we'll learn more about him when we get to more in depth, but just realize even in the mention of the name, the fact of the absence of the reason why his name is Yitzchak in Parsha Lech Lecha opens the door from a methodological perspective for Rashi to say, what is the deeper meaning of the name Yitzchak? Again, you and me, we read it and say, well, it says that Avram laughed. By the way, when you get to Parshat Vayera, Sarah Imenu is also going to laugh, and it's going to say that she called him Yitzchak, and it's going to say, Tzchok asali Elokim, because God made laughter for me and for those around me, right? Now, we'll have to get there when we get there. Understand, well, that part, I guess, Hashem didn't tell her, or Hashem did tell her, and she was echoing it. But there is an explanation. Here, no explanation. Rashi says there is an explanation. And realize how important Yitzchak Avinu will be and the legacy that he carries and the way, and to my point a moment ago about Yitzchak being like the middle link in the chain, is the idea that without that 10th test, the relationship between Hashem and Avram Avinu and Hashem rather, would not have been the full 10 tests. Yitzchak is a crucial component of this. Absolutely. And I believe not just as object, but I think there's also a subject component there as well. Certainly if he's 37 and he's engaged in Gevura and self-contraction to enable his father to potentially offer him as an offering, etc. Now, Yishmael is not a zero. I mean, this is very challenging in the heat of the moment, and I don't live in Eretz Yisrael. I don't put myself in the place of people who have to deal with these struggles day in, day out. But the end game still has to involve saying, okay, at some level, this is a child of Avram Avinu. This is a child of Avram Avinu. And there's a bracha that Hashem gave this child of Avram Avinu and the descendants of this child of Avram Avinu. Doesn't mean it's going to supersede or overtake issues of the Brit. But when the language will, God forbid, stoop to the everyone talking language that is not conduct unbecoming. Okay, but we believe in the Torah. We believe that if God wanted to wipe out Yishmael, would have said wipe out Yishmael. Would have said Yishmael doesn't have any standing in the world. But Belochein, that's not the pshat, and I believe that's not what Chazal communicate either. Videi, we'll see it in Rashi in Parshat Vayera. Kachnet bincha yichidcha shrahavta Yitzchak. Take your son, your only son. Take your son. I have two sons. Take your only son. Rashi quotes it from the Gemara. I have two sons who are the only son of their mother. Asher ahavti, the son who you love. What does Avram say? I love both my kids. God didn't have to tell him, no, take Yitzchak. It's in Avram Avinu's mind. There's this ongoing tumult about I have these children and I love them. Right? So just to think about what that means again, but keep it in perspective. God is harping on Brit. My Brit is with Yitzchak. It's not, and the one that is born Davka at Brit Yitzchak Asher Teled Lecha Sarah, not somebody else, just him. And the crucial component here is that Yitzchak emanates specifically from Sarah Imenu. That's a vital piece. Now, after Hashem finishes speaking to Avram Avinu here, the Torah actually tells us that Hashem, so to speak, elevated from above Avraham. Now, hard to understand what that means. Not physical, but the idea that some of the Mefarshim point this out. The idea that in order for Avinu to do this mitzvah, in order for it to actually be something that he was going to do as a commanded being, he couldn't at that moment be on the receiving end of Nevuah and Ruach HaKodesh. There needed to be, if you will, a withdrawal on the part of a Kodesh Baruch Hu for Avinu to wake up, not be in a trance-like state of prophecy, just to wake up and say, okay, what do I do now? Now, there's no pause here. Doesn't mean Avinu didn't spend days thinking about it. The next pasuk is a pasuk already of action. My point is just to say, at the moment of doing the mitzvah, if Avinu was still in some prophetic state, you say, well, God was with him, and therefore, it obviously everything was happening al pi nevuah. But what do you want the rest of us to do? The point is, what made it a test is that even an Avram Avinu, who got these great spiritual moments, could also have moments after which, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu is, as it were, withdrawn from him. Now, what are you going to do? You can do the mitzvah or not do the mitzvah? Vayikach Avraham et Yishmael beno, ve'et kol yilidei ve'to, ve'et kol miknat kaspo, kol zachar be'anshei beit Avraham, vayamal et besar orlatam, be'etzem hayom hazeh kasher diber yito Elohim. So in that very day, be'etzem hazeh, specifically, bo bayom, Rashi says, during the day, he didn't wait till night. That's a halach. We don't do Brit Milah at night. But in the midst of the essence of the day, the heart of the day, he didn't want to hide it away. He wasn't complaining, wasn't hiding. He said, "I'm just going to do what I need to do." He gave Brit Milah to all these people, and Rashi, in fact, says that he was not afraid, not of the nations, not of the cynics, not of his enemies, people in his generation, anyone who wanted to make these claims. He said, I'm doing this in full view. I'm not hiding it away. I'm not ashamed, embarrassed, scared. Do what I have to do. Then we learned that Avram gave himself a Brit Milah. Avram ben Tishivatesh Shana b'himolo b'sar lato. He gave himself a Brit Milah. Here, Rashi points out, it's not in all the versions of Rashi, some of the manuscripts, so it's quoted in the Chumash, but not all of them have it. We don't know if Rashi actually wrote it. One of his students put it into his commentary. But that Avinu was very, very old. He's 99 years old. So it describes that Hashem, as it were, put his hand, quotation marks, air quotes, on Avram Avinu's hand to help him do the Brit Milah. That's what it means in the pasuk, V'charot imo habrit. He forged the covenant with him. And the idea that Hashem helps the individual who's trying to do a mitzvah, as challenging it is, as it were, Avram Avinu could feel the gentle hand of Hashem on his hand, helping him to perform the mitzvah. I always think that the reason why it's in parentheses and that it's only in some manuscripts, not in all, is because of that earlier pasuk in pasuk Chavbet, verse 22, that says that Hashem went up, as it were, from above Avram. Means he elevated himself from Avram. Means he left Avram to his own devices to figure out, am I going to do this or not? So if his hand is back on it, so does that mean really Hashem was so involved? You could see it both ways. And not necessarily a contradiction. You could say Hashem has his hand on Avram Avinu's hand. Means Hashem helps a person who comes to do a mitzvah. Yishmael beno ben 13 shana b'himoloi pesar lato. Yishmael is 13 years of age when his Brit Milah transpires. Be'etzem yom hazeh nimol Avram v'Yishmael beno v'chol anshe veito yelid bayit miknat kesef me'et ben echar nimolu ito. All the people live in the house. All the members of the household, they're all part of the covenant, at least as far as the act of Brit Milah is concerned. What's interesting is that even though this is happening, God has already told Avram Avinu that he has a son who has not yet been born. And that son is actually the son with whom there will be the covenant ongoing. Now, so what was this? So there's a mitzvah of Brit Milah, min hastam, in terms of forging a relationship with the Kodesh Baruch Hu, and that there is something positive if you live in the house of an Avram Avinu to be in an elevated status spiritually for the men. That involves the Brit Milah. It did not mean, however, that they were going to be part of the actual covenant ongoing. It was an act of circumcision that had implications in terms of its spiritual elevation to be in Avram's house. There are mitzvot, by the way, that come about later in the Torah describing an Eved Knani in the home of a Jew, getting a Brit Milah, having certain mitzvot, etc. We're kind of out of time, so I can go into it, but this here brings us to the end of chapter 17. I wanted to pause. If people had questions, comments, I'm sorry, I did all the talking today completely. Anyone? Thoughts?
question.
Joshi, please.
Yishmael is 13 years old when he has this bris, and to this day they do their bris at age 13. I think it's a good argument to say, don't you think that that's on a higher level than somebody who's 8 days old and doesn't even have it's like we say, if Yitzchak was 39 years old or 37 when he did the Akedah, that's a whole lot higher than if he's, 2 years old. So,
You're 100% right. That's the way the Torah describes it. The Torah specifically describes that Yishmael is 13 years of age. And by the by, is it wrong to say, wow, what so to speak, a spiritual feather in the cap of any people that's willing to give Brit Mila to 13-year-olds?
Yeah.
Now, that's because it's historical fact. By the by, every time that happens to the 13-year-old in the Ishmaelite traditions, so we should realize that they want to sign on to be the children of Yishmael and the legacy that comes with that, right? Which also includes you're not part of the Brit, of the covenant of Avinu in terms of the land, etc. Yeah, I'm not making a political statement over here. Again, I'm not an Ezrach Medinat Israel yet. I have I'm among the Chovavei Tzion, but I'm living in Libiva Mizrach, Merkaz Ma'arav. So I'm like in the Midwest over here. And we shouldn't extrapolate, taking directly from the Tanakh. And this is what we should apply to political policies. I'm not a military strategist. I'm not a politician. I don't even live there. So, but you're absolute. I think there's something here about Mesirut Nefesh that we should be able to say, wow, look at this child of Avinu and the descendants of this child of Avinu have a continued Mesirut Nefesh for what they believe in passionately. Now, why for us is it at 8 days? Because the Torah says so. Because that's the mitzvah. And because the first Jew ever born into the world who received a Brit Milah when he was born, Yitzchak Avinu, 8 days old. Understand? Right. So I don't see any, personally, mitzidi, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying, wow, Yitaki, look at the Mesirus Nefesh. I made this point in shul many times. And you see the Mesirus Nefesh that they have for davening, for what they believe in, sometimes things that I consider completely abhorrent. I'm not claiming I'm endorsing it. I'm just saying, but you learn something about, wow, look at that attachment to their version of what they think is a mitzvah. Man, that should put us on notice to be even more so for us.
Yes, and Yishmael uses that argument against Yitzchak later on.
Right? And we have our own argument quietly without fighting, but we're doing what we do. And that's correct. And by the way, that's, as you mentioned, that's Rashi will quote that at the Akedah. That's one of the things, according to Chazal, that's going back and forth, that Yishmael says, I was 13, you were only 8 days old. Why is that in the mouth of Yishmael? They literally have that conversation. They might have had that conversation. But alternatively, isn't that the ongoing dialogue between the two nations till today? You're 8 days old. The kid has no choice. Of course the kid's going to go along with it. They're 8 days old. If they could protest, they'd run away. But they can't. But we, with 13, like we're strong. Right? You're right. But you know what, Yishmael? This is what we've been saying back to Yishmael the generations. Yishmael, if a Kadosh Baruch Hu asked us for entire bodies to sacrifice in his name, we would do it. And our legacy, sadly, we're coming right now from Tisha B'Av, our legacy of Kiddush Hashem is a sad one, but there's also greatness in that. I mean, it's very sad. I'm not saying anyone called it upon themselves, but there's greatness there.
But if you fast forward to Mamad Har Sinai, or let's say the Midrashim about how God offered the Torah to all the nations, and they rejected it. So then you could say, oh, fine, you could make a argument. I mean, the Torah
Agreed. He offered it to them. They didn't want. Again, did Hashem come with a delegation and meet with the leadership, or is the point these nations were not misugalim? They would not have been able to take this. This is not something they would have ever accepted, because for them, by the way, it wasn't exactly cash and prizes. 630 years is a lot of responsibility.
We can argue
unfortunately, a sad history. Sorry, you want to say?
We didn't accept it until Purim, right? We had hard reviews.
The Gemara and Shabbos. We did accept it. We did accept it. But we always had a claim. Wait a minute. It's not that we didn't accept it. We did accept it. But there was a muda rabbi little right to the Gemara says. There was always like a little asterisk, like a little caveat. we could say, yeah, but God came to us and told us it's me. So did we really have a choice to say no?
We
don't have a
accepted
choice.
it.
Okay,
It's an offer we
but
couldn't refuse. The mountain's
historically-
hanging over my head. I'm going to say no to God? No, I said yes. But in
One
Purim,
second.
we had a choice.
No. Historically, we have Yirmiyahu, Yoshiyahu, we have all these people yelling at us, do the right thing. I mean, we
Yeah.
go through all Navi, right?
Right.
Obviously, we didn't accept it with our full heart because we were always going for Avodah Zarah.
And look what happened. And look what happened. But
And
by
look what's
Purim, which is
happening.
after those Nevi'im, Davka, that's the Kiblu v'Kiblua B'mei Achashverosh. Anyway, that's all we have time for this morning. You're quite right. I wish everyone a great rest of the summer. Look for the next email next time we're going to go back on. I don't know if it'll be in Elul because, as you know, it's a very strange year right now. So if we're going to start Vayera right away, it might be after the Chagim, but I'm going to do other things during Chodesh Elul to get everyone ready in the community as best we can for our unique, unprecedented Rosh Hashanah, which a certainty, no matter what, is that Rosh Hashanah will transpire, and a certainty is that Klal Yisrael be Mamlich HaKadosh Baruch Hu will give him the Keter Melucha, and we will not permit Corona to have the crown, but rather give the crown to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, be Mamlich him upon us, and in fact, upon all nations and all creatures and over the entire world. Ad Kan for today. Be well, everybody.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.